Shut up and sit down.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Watches Etc. I've been asked by a few of our subscribers, which by the way are now up to almost 250. I'm quite astounded by that, so really thanks for subscribing guys. I can't believe that so many people are interested in our little channel, and I'm blown away by the support that we're getting. Really, thank you so much. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. I've been asked by a couple of our subscribers how I make money to be able to fund my hobby. So today, I'm going to share with you a little bit about myself. As many of you know, I'm not a professional watch dealer and have a full-time job which takes me off around the world. But I'm far from a millionaire, so to be able to buy watches, I need an additional income stream, and for me, that is through trading watches. So here's how I got started. About 20 years ago, I started my watch collection, having somewhat stumbled into the hobby. I started off getting interested through my dad initially, who, although he never had any high-end pieces, he always retained a bit of an interest in watches. Like many, I started off looking first at fashion watches, and eventually come across what would be my first ever automatic watch, the Invicta Pro Diver. And it's a watch I still have to this day. At the time, I couldn't afford a Rolex, and was immediately attracted to the aesthetics of the Pro Diver, given that it was pretty much a copy of the Submariner. When I first got the watch, I was blown away. This little case of perpetual magic that didn't need winding and didn't need batteries, and kept perfect time almost. All in a watch that I thought was finished nicely enough, and at an affordable price. I really enjoyed the piece, and it really was the gateway drug for me into the hobby. As I progressed in my levels of interest, I began to sign up to watch forums and, at the time, Yahoo groups. Remember them? By immersing myself somewhat geekily on the forums, not really contributing much initially, but certainly reading, I began to absorb information. Information about brands and history, about movement types, and about the different tiers of watches and people's perceptions and preferences. All of this whilst learning and forming the foundations for what would become my own preferences in time. At that stage, I could only dream about paying some of the fees that these watches were collecting. And I realised that many of the posters on the forum were not just enthusiasts or collectors, but were actually either professional or amateur watch dealers, trading in some amazing brands like Rolex, Omega, Panerai, IWC, and JLC, just to name a few. You name it, they were trading it on the forums, and this really caught my interest. I started following and studying those guys to figure out what they were doing and how they were doing it. I was particularly interested in hearing how they were getting access to such a broad range of timepieces, and how they were sourcing the watches at the right price, i.e. not at retail, and lastly, having got the watches, how they went about preparing those pieces for sale. Servicing, taking photos, advertising, marketing, describing the watches and that type of thing. And once I understood that, or at least understood the basics, I felt that I knew enough to say, well, sod it, if these guys can do it, why can't I? Now, I was never interested in being a professional watch dealer, but I was interested in generating an income so that I could afford some of the watches that I had been infatuated by, progressing up the ladder, so to speak, from the likes of my Invicta and Seiko collection to what I considered were more high-end pieces. Early on, I really wanted a Submariner and an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. But at that time, I couldn't justify purchasing any of those pieces because, well, like most people who are not born with a silver spoon in their mouth, I had other financial responsibilities. It seemed pretty straightforward though, but to me the biggest issue was around access. Where could I find watches to sell? Well, for me, I found them in two ways. Firstly, goes without saying, online. specifically hunting down particular watches that I wanted to buy on secondhand forums, on eBay and specialist watch sites. The other way was by using some contacts I'd made and establishing a relationship with a small independent dealer in my town. This person had a bricks and mortar shop and didn't have a huge turnaround of trade, but would instead have a fairly steady stream, just sufficient for him to get by and make a comfortable living. He had no grand ambitions about expanding and was happy operating his small business in our sleepy little town. Having built a relationship with him and getting to know him, I was upfront and said that, look, during any slow periods, if he was ever in need of cash flow, I would purchase stock from him, no questions asked, or well, very few questions, giving him a small profit margin, but allowing me the margins to be able to sell it on later. This meant that in slow months, he could offload a watch that he had had sitting in his safe for a while for a small profit of maybe 1 or 2% on what he paid, so he wasn't losing any money, but that would allow me to sell for a higher price at a slower time and still make something on it. There were even times when he sold me pieces making a loss on them, simply to move on the watch, so he could focus on the higher end Patek Philippe's and gold Rolexes that he specialised in. So with a supply of watches, the next thing I had to do was figure out pricing. I knew what the retail prices of these watches were, but I needed to do a lot of research to better understand the wholesale market. The key to this was research, research, and research. For me, this was the hardest bit to understand. And of course, I made mistakes along the way, but there were no shortcuts. I was online a hell of a lot, reading and talking to those who knew the business, reading some more, checking distribution channels and monitoring, and then being bold enough, actually having the balls to go and make an offer to traders who were selling watches. So, as an example, just say that I wanted to buy an Omega Speedmaster that was selling for around £4,500 to £5,000. Well, I would identify 10 or 12 of those watches that I wanted to buy, 10 or 12 of the same model that is, and go to the sellers and make an offer that was closer to the wholesale price, so in this instance, offering under £4,000. As I say, this takes some balls, and many times I would get laughed out of the shop or over the phone, and I wouldn't always get the watch. But I would say that for every 10 or 12 offers I made, one of those would get accepted, and that one was all I needed, because having secured the watch at or very near wholesale price, I had a great opportunity to sell that watch on for between a couple of £100 to £1,000 profit that would all go into the kitty for my dream watch. So that took me to the next step, which was actually being able to sell the watch. Why would anyone want to buy from me instead of going to a shop or another online trader? Well, to start with, I did it the same way as when buying. I went to the same watch distribution channels, the forums, to eBay, to Amazon, to Facebook, and before Facebook, I even used MySpace and Friendster. I used those Yahoo groups and chat sites, and in more modern times, sites like Instagram. I would hit all of those distribution channels and get the word out that I had a watch to sell, marketing the watch to thousands of potential buyers. Critical, however, is that I first had to figure out everything about the watch. The history, any faults or blemishes on the case. I really didn't want any nasty surprises later having sold the watch. And of course, something which was hugely important, the photos. I learnt very quickly that a good set of clear photos was key. Cell phones then weren't as they are today, so I needed a decent camera for this. But the extra effort was well worth it. A good photo really will help your watch stand out against any other sellers who are selling similar pieces and really elevates the chances of a sale. Let me say, this isn't a get-rich-quick scheme type of thing. It isn't going to be overnight, and it can be hard work. But if you really love the hobby of watches and live and breathe timepieces, it's a really interesting and fulfilling way to make some extra cash. And for me, it was never about becoming a millionaire or building a watch-selling empire. I simply wanted a way to be able to afford some of the better watches that I wanted for myself. That was what turned me on, motivated me, and kept me going. All it took was a little bit of digging, homework, dedication to understand, and man hours. There wasn't any magic secret to this. All the information was already online. I just needed to want to find it enough. I should also say that all the research in the world isn't going to help you make any money if you don't actually put yourself out there and pull the trigger. You really need to buy the watch to sell. Like I said, I didn't always get it right. Sometimes early on I barely even broke even on a piece. But as I got better and more experienced in pricing, and better at identifying the watches that I wanted, and understanding the top and bottom retail prices alongside the wholesale price schemes, I also got better in making a profit. One thing that never changed, however, was the ratio of purchases to offers. It was always around the 1 in 10 to 1 in 12 figure. So I would have to hunt down up to 12 watches and put in time to talk to the sellers of those watches and negotiate, and was only ever successful in one of those transactions. But for me that was fine. I enjoyed it, and I knew in my head that if I did it 100 times, I'd be able to buy around 9 or 10 watches, making me between £200 and £1,000 profit on each one, depending on the watch. So over time, I was then able to develop a nose for watches at the right price. And these days, I'm able to be a bit more selective and pick and choose when I buy and sell watches. The truth is, given how often I travel for work these days, I'm trading watches less and less. But with a family to support, I still often dip back into the trade when I need to bump up the cash a little bit to buy my next big piece. Many of you know I've just purchased an FP Journe, and this one is going to hurt the bank balance. So I better get off to start looking at other purchases so I can sell them on and help contribute to the price. You are never too old for a little additional income. Well, that's about all for today, guys. My little story of how I got started. I hope you've enjoyed learning how I caught the watch bug and how I came to be able to trade watches to sustain my interest in the hobby. So all that's left to say is thanks for watching, keep smiling, and see you again soon for another episode of Watches Etc.